In this final lecture for Unit 2, I will give a brief overview of the definitions of rhetoric, show how it's related to ethics, and then review key points from the Katz and Lipis readings. First, I want to turn to a PowerPoint that will clarify aspects of rhetoric that have been briefly raised in a few of our readings. The most well-known definition of rhetoric is from Aristotle, who wrote that the goal of rhetoric is not to persuade, but to see the available means of persuasion in each case. This suggests that persuasion is not a simple or static act, but rather is dependent on a range of factors embedded in each particular case. So you're not trying to persuade, you're trying to see what the best way to persuade is in each individual situation. Furthermore, this quote suggests that the end goal of rhetoric is not always persuasion. Indeed, the purpose for communication, as the Purdue OWL notes, may be to elicit any number of responses, ranging from understanding, to emotional reaction, to agreement, to enlightenment, or any one of almost limitless reactions. This notion of eliciting a reaction, rather than trying to persuade someone of something, is particularly important in technical writing, which, as Stephen Katz claims, leads to action and thus always impacts on human life. So again, rhetoric is not just argumentative writing or persuasive speech, but it's trying to deliberately get a reaction or action on part of a listener or audience. To say that instructions and procedures are rhetorical is to argue that in order to be effective, such documents must be written optimally for a particular rhetorical situation. That is why I'm having you develop these scenarios for your visual and textual instructions. In the PowerPoint, I provide a diagram of the rhetorical situation that breaks it down into the relationships between the rhetor, which is a fancy way of saying the speaker, the writer, the designer, the audience, and the purpose of communication. The white triangle is the text, which can be any genre or any medium. And then context is the circle that surrounds and impacts all of the other variables. This diagram is admittedly simple, but it helps show that rhetorical analysis, that is, examining a rhetorical situation to see how different elements impact each other, is a practical tool, not just a theoretical concept. So this diagram can be applied to any kind of situation where you are developing a document or giving a speech or designing something, making a video, whatever it is. You can apply this diagram to that situation and then ask, how does the rhetor impact the audience? How does audience impact purpose? How is text being shared between these three? Is the context the same for the audience, for the rhetor, and for the purpose, or is it different? Asking these questions helps you think about what you, as the rhetor, need to do in order to accomplish something, or potentially what you as the audience are receiving, if that makes sense. So if you are trying to compel someone to take an action, the more you know about that person, their purpose, particularly compared to your own purpose, and they might be different, and the shared context or unshared context, sometimes they may be in another country, as we'll talk about in a second, the more successful your text will be. To say that ethics is rhetorical, then, is to argue that what counts as ethical action is shaped by situation and shapes behavior. This is one of the primary arguments made by Stephen Katz in the piece that we read for today. This is one of the Again, this is one of the primary arguments that Katz makes. This is why we read the memo written by Just. So this first memo on the first page is written by an officer in Germany during the Holocaust named Just. This is why when we read this memo, we have such a strong reaction. This memo was written in a cultural context where certain behavior was considered ethical because certain people were not considered human. So when Just writes about cargo, it's very disturbing to us, but it didn't have the same ethical implications in that society that it does here. What counts as ethical behavior then, again, is not universal or static, but rather culturally and socially shaped. As Katz writes, in any highly bureaucratic, technological, capitalistic society, it is often the human being who must adapt to the system, which has been developed to perform a specific function, and which is thus always necessarily geared toward the continuance of its own operation. What this quote means is that in a particular culture, how that culture is established operates sort of above and beyond the individual people within it. So the human being must adapt to the system rather than the system adapting to the person. This is what leads to situations like Just's memo. Katz's point about the ethics of expediency, which he defines as the quality of being convenient and practical despite being improper or immoral, is that it changed what counted as ethical behavior in Germany, so that being practical was more important than being humane. Anything that did not support the larger goal of Nazi Germany was against expediency and thus unethical. To us, this seems unethical. It seems very clearly to be a very disturbing and upsetting situation, but it just wasn't for Just who wrote it. For Germany during the Holocaust, expediency reigned supreme. As Katz writes, when expediency becomes an end in itself, or is coupled with personal or political or corporate or scientific or technological goals that are not also and ultimately rooted in humanitarian concerns, as is often the case, ethical problems arise. So again, in this situation, Katz is arguing that technological expediency became more important than humanitarian concerns. Interestingly, Katz asserts that in the United States today, the dominant ethic is one of economic expediency. He offers two examples, and I offer a third. His first one is an airline that accepts high insurance costs on plane crashes rather than improve the safety of planes. And his second is an automotive company that chose to incur lawsuits rather than recall a vehicle with a defect that led to multiple injuries and deaths. So again, in both of these situations, you have a corporation that is deciding that economics is more important than potential loss of human life. A more recent example of this is the Volkswagen emissions scandal from a couple years ago. The Volkswagen Group of America was caught cheating emissions tests using software that allowed their diesel vehicles to show improved emissions under laboratory conditions. Cars sold to consumers would then have this feature disabled so that the company could sell diesel cars in the US and market their vehicles as though they were much better for the environment than they actually were. Had they not done this, they would have been forced to have a costly and time-consuming recall or to spend more time and money developing the product that actually met those emissions standards in the United States in the first place. And so this isn't just a matter of the car itself, it impacted their marketing. A Volkswagen ad advertising really clean diesel led to the company being charged with deceiving consumers by the US Federal Trade Commission. Here's that ad. So they only cheated the emissions scandal so that they could claim that their diesel was cleaner than their competitors and thus gain a leg up in the sort of lucrative diesel market in the United States. Again, situations like this only become possible where behavior isn't questioned and when actions are compelled by an ethics that is not based on what Katz terms humanitarian concerns. In this case, selling cars was more important than making sure that those cars did not either break emissions laws or that they would not contribute negatively to pollution, which they were proven actually to do. For our instructions assignment, it's important to consider ethical implications of language in the scenarios that we construct. Now, I deliberately paired Katz with Lipus because both warn of the dangers that isolation and insularity pose for effective communication and ethical rhetorical action. That is, when the rhetor, when the speaker, the designer, the creator, is isolated from their audience, is not in the same context, and makes no attempt to understand the audience. Not just the audience's needs, but what she argues in this is their culture and their language. When that doesn't happen, you get isolation, and then that breaks down how effective communication can be. The emissions scandal at Volkswagen, for instance, was only discovered when researchers outside of the company tested the diesel vehicles in non-laboratory environments. What was an ethical behavior compelled by economic expediency became an unethical and illegal action when viewed from another ethical context. Similarly, Lipus shows how language and cultural differences create the potential for unethical action on the part of corporations who produce instructions as manuals for global audiences. As she writes, when businesses devote resources to making product documentation adequate for internal consumers, they also meet the ethical standards of utility, rights, justice, and care. If companies push their products to a more diverse user, but don't prepare safety documentation that takes into account the cultural and language differences of those users, they are no longer writing with a humanitarian ethic in mind. That is, they're no longer thinking first about the user's needs over their own. As Lipus writes further, when businesses provide adequate instructions, they respect the rights of consumers to be treated as ends, as human beings with basic safety needs, and not merely as means to make a profit. I assigned this article because it focuses specifically on instructions, because it makes a very clear connection to the humanitarian concerns that Katz draws our attention to, and because it offers practical recommendations for writing instructions and procedures for international audiences that is organized by the stages of the writing process. For the sake of time, I want to call your attention to 3 of these 5 categories, but the others are definitely worth reading as well. The first is planning, which consists of defining the scope of instructions, determining the audience's native language and level of English proficiency, describing the product's functions and limitations, identifying relevant legal regulations within that country or region or area, and using durable materials that won't degrade or become difficult to read over time. Next is getting and keeping audience attention, which requires the author to consider culturally appropriate decisions for organization, sentence and paragraph structure, and page design, which also includes layout, color, white space, etc. Her point is that a lot of these concepts are culturally rooted. So color, for example, certain colors have different meanings in different countries. Similarly, she says that arrangement is different based on the country. Japanese users might expect the more detailed information to be placed before less detailed information, while German users might expect to start with a clear overview of the possible functions, and Chinese users might expect to start with a step-by-step information about basic functions. The more that you understand about these cultural differences, and the more you recognize that cultural differences exist in the first place, the more prepared you will be to develop your writing to fit an international audience. And finally, aiding comprehension by writing readable text with short, focused sentences, active voice, commands, or the imperative, which we talked about in the last lecture, limited abbreviations, jargon, or acronyms, and designing effective graphics that are culturally appropriate, use consistent and universally understood symbols, and avoid using text that must then be translated. So one of her points is that the danger sign sometimes has an exclamation point, and sometimes it has a hand. The hand has certain cultural implications in different countries. If you don't understand which of these is more common in the country for which you are writing a set of instructions, then you're more likely to choose something that will be misinterpreted or misunderstood. Now again, this is being written mostly in the mind of corporations who might be dealing with the same company, same country, that kind of thing. Finally, Lipus concludes with the following statement that does an excellent job of showing the importance of rhetoric and ethics for technical writing. So I want to read the entire statement. In addition to a legal obligation to protect consumers with adequate product documentation, businesses have an ethical duty to accommodate cultural differences among their consumers, to respect their customers' rights of safety, and to provide their customers with products that live up to their claims. These practices are not only ethical, but also practical, because they can enhance the reputation of the company, protect the company from potential liability litigation, and open more trade opportunities in countries that protect their citizens from unsafe and defective products. Again, comparing this to the behavior of the two companies that Katz identifies and the Volkswagen example, you can see how they both lost their ethical responsibility and their practical responsibility to stakeholders, shareholders, and investors. Because they were unethical, they produced a product that was not as good. Keep this in mind as you're developing your instructions, particularly if you're developing instructions that you think might be used by users who do not primarily speak English or who are not from the United States specifically, and who might have cultural differences. And perhaps you yourself, some of you are from other countries, you need to think then about what cultural assumptions and cultural background you have that might be read differently in the United States, or might be read differently by another country different from where you are from. That's it for today. Good luck as you work on drafts of your visual and textual instructions.